Good morning, students. Dr. Armstrong here. Hope this morning finds you well. I'm going to go over a couple of chapters with you today. Chapter 10, Athletes Speak for Themselves. This is a rather short chapter, and if you read it, you know that the author spent some time interviewing coaches and athletes and came up with some interesting things. I thought I would just filter out some of the main ideas for you. He talked about practice. One of the things that the coaches indicated was that they wished that they had more techniques to teach sport pedagogy, to teach skills. A lot was talked about imitating a game situation. And for example, I think I asked the question in class one time, when do you shoot free throws in practice? Well, you don't do it when you're all rested, you do it when you're tired, because that's the way it's going to be in the game. The author talked about pregame, and he emphasized how important it is that the players and the captains, if there are captains, give their input. And it's interesting, one of the things he talked about was not forcing forcing a pregame meal. Some of the coaches out there are still from the old school of, I got to have that steak before the game, and really we know it's more about food that's going to provide energy quicker than you might get from protein from a steak. And the author also suggested that you leave the pregame talk for possibly halftime instead. During the game, the athletes' biggest complaints were anger from the coach and the negative comments that he or she made during the game. In postgame, immediate game review wasn't necessarily always the best timing, depending on the outcome, of course. The athletes found that it was best if the coaches pointed out attributions, and you'll recall we used that term in a chapter or two before. Attributions, the contributors or the influencers of the game's outcome. For example, okay, we had this difficulty in the game. We know this was because of this, and it makes it a little bit more organized and easy to take. In terms of behaviors off the field, here's an interesting comment. Parents need to give space to athletes who want to be independent. The coaches need to be available to the athletes. Coaches can't be friends to athletes. Now, this is one of the biggest problems for young coaches. They feel like they want to be friends with their athletes, and it's not like you don't want to be friends with them or be friendly, but you now have a new role as coach, and regardless of the age, even if it's just a few years difference, the new coach has to assume that coach role, which is not a friend to the athlete. And I know that when I first started out coaching, that was one of the most difficult things to monitor. And then finally, the author talks about the differing perceptions between coach and athlete. In other words, as a coach, my perception of myself is this, but my athlete's perception of me is this. And it's hardly ever the same if you compare them. And coaches seldom feel the need to include athletes in strategy for game or practice. And obviously, they should consider that, including athletes, and especially team captains, if there are captains, in talk about strategy for game as well as practice. All right, let's move on to chapter 11. This is a rather long chapter, effective communication and mentoring techniques. Now I'm going to read this straight from the book. This is the purpose of the chapter, is to provide insight into ways to establish high quality coaching athlete relationships and to introduce specific communication techniques that will improve the coach's ability to share his or her knowledge, which in turn will benefit the athlete's skills and performance. Now, a note before I begin, throughout this lecture, I may at times share some personal experiences that I've had in terms of either as athlete or as coach that I feel that are relevant, that might help make a good example. Your author starts to talk about dialoguing communication skills. Nonverbal communication is mentioned a number of times through this chapter. They can be helpful and they can be destructive. Now, nonverbal is facial expression, the eyes, body language, arms, hands. We know that if we talk to somebody and they got their arms folded and their legs crossed, and we know that that's not a very inviting situation, as opposed to talking to somebody where they're leaning forward and they have eye contact. We know that just the rolling of the eyes would just, you may not say something, but you can give a facial expression that just says volumes. And so a lot of times you may say a particular thing, but your facial expression or your gestures mean much more, and sometimes will actually cover up the message that you wanted to get across. Speaking with parents is inevitable as a coach. Don't ignore, but then don't be intimidated either. And that's an easy thing to say. It's a tough thing to try to do as a young coach. Messages from administrators must be consistent. You can't have double standards. And I think that in these times right now where we find ourselves, if you were an administrator and you've got these senior athletes in high school whose sport and lives basically have been shattered by the closing of school, the canceling of sports season. Can you imagine being a very high level or elite athlete in high school who's in a spring sport, and all of a sudden that season has been shattered and you're scrambling looking for a track to practice on or a tennis court to play? Here in Columbus, the city has taken down all the rims off of every backboard in the city parks. So even if you wanted to go play by yourself at a court, there's no basket. They're taking the nets down from tennis courts. So these are troubling times, and as an administrator, you can see how difficult it would be to not succumb to an athlete's plea to, can I just come onto the track? You know me, I won't bring anybody else. And if they're trying to be consistent that way, that's tough. And good communication technique is very helpful there. Your author gives 10 commandments of effective communication in sport. And these are kind of interesting. The first one is honesty, being upfront with the athletes. Don't promise things and then not come through. For example, and your book gives this example of a coach telling an athlete, if you do this and this, you'll start next week, and then it doesn't happen. Well, obviously coaches can do what they want, but the messages are out there. This would include recruiting. And if any of you get into, maybe some of you went through this when you were in high school in the recruiting process, or if you become a college coach, and recruiting is such a huge component of the college game right now. And so it is so easy to tell the potential athlete what he or she wants to hear. And but you have to remember that you have to be honest with that athlete and don't go off the track in terms of what you can promise. You don't want to be defensive. This is another commandment. You don't always have to be right. Own up to your own mistakes. Be receptive to new ideas, and don't be a passive listener. Now, what is a passive listener? If I were to, if you came into my office, if I had an office there at Mount Vernon, if you came into my office and you said you wanted to talk, I said, sure. I'm going to continue to work on this report here, if you don't mind. And so I'm listening, I'm typing, I may have answered the telephone, I'm talking on the phone, and you're talking along, and I'm getting half of it. And that's a passive listener. You need to be an honest listener, and you need to be consistent. An open door policy, your text talks about. Now, let me make an exception to that. It's good to have an open door policy if that's what you like. Now, I've worked with some folks in college that they keep their door closed all the time. That's fine. That you can knock on the door. They just don't like the door open. Personally, I left my door open most of the time in all the offices I was ever at. Actually, the first office I ever had didn't have a door. But if you have an open door policy, it's good to be consistent with that. However, men, if you end up coaching women and you have one of your athletes come in to speak with you, do not close the door. Now, you may pull the door to a little, but you want to have a big space there between the casing and the door frame, and you don't want any kind of an opportunity, even if there is obviously no intention of wrong, but even the thought of something going on. That's just a word to the wise, and remember that, if you will. Commandment number 4 is don't be sarcastic. I have a friend whose New Year's resolution was to stop being sarcastic. I'm not sure if he was able to keep that, but sarcasm is called a sound barrier to learning, a mental hazard. The message is lost in the sarcastic remark. One of the things that comes to my mind when I think about sarcasm is a teacher I had in high school my junior year. We were writing research papers. Mine was it turned out to be awful in terms of the formatting, but that's another thing. I wrote about Oscar Robertson, my favorite basketball player, and he, as some of you know, he's known as the Big O, and that was the title on the cover of my paper, the Big O. And when I handed it in, the teacher said, "The Big O, boy, that's original," and that cut me. I thought, what is wrong with that? And it was a bit of sarcasm, and I don't know that she realized how much that hurt. It's not like I've needed therapy over the years for it, but don't be sarcastic. Another one of the commandments is to praise and criticize behavior, not personality. Praise should be specific if you're giving praise to somebody. You don't want to do generalities and hyperboles. You don't want to, oh, you're great, you're the best I've ever seen. If you're going to praise somebody, praise them in specific terms. And praise of personality can be misinterpreted as you like me or you don't like me. If I say you're the best, or you're the next best, or you're one of the best, that can be misinterpreted. There's a term called judgmental praise, where we say you're the best, But this tends to create anxiety, and it'll cause defensiveness if what you say about that individual is misinterpreted as, why am I only one of the best? Why aren't I the best? Your author talks about an approach called the sandwich approach, where you make you start with a positive statement, and then you use what's called a future-oriented feedback, followed by a compliment. And so when you're meeting with somebody in regard to an issue, you don't just jump right into the issue necessarily. Every situation's different, but you start with something that breaks the ice, that's positive, and then you work into the issue, and then you end up with a compliment at the end. Your author suggests that coaches be empathetic. Empathy, it's not sympathy, it's empathy. You know what they're going through, you feel what they're going through, and you have some cause or intent to demonstrate that empathy. As you are empathetic, don't attack the athlete's character. And you'll see that vein throughout this chapter in terms of not dwelling on an individual's personality, we're dwelling on their behavior. Be sensitive to the feelings of others. You know, what is nothing to you could be a big thing for somebody else in terms of the way they feel. Don't let teammates be verbally abusive of each other. Don't embarrass anyone. Here's another personal example, and I'm going back to that same English teacher in 11th grade. I don't even know what was being said in the class, but I kind of fell into a trap and made a comment, and she grabbed it and ran with it, and it ended up it was some type of almost a sexual situation. I can't even remember what it was, but it made me feel terribly embarrassed. I'm sure I turned 10 shades of red. The whole class laughed, and now I am positive that teacher at the time knew what she was doing, and I'm not sure why, but it was terribly embarrassing. And you've all been embarrassed at times, and I think when you are in charge of a team or you're teaching a class, you will become more and more familiar with those opportunities to be empathetic. You should respect the integrity of others, and mainly dealing with anger. You know, anger is based on irrational statements and behaviors. If anger is demonstrated, and I'm not saying that you can't be angry, but if you are, obviously it's helpful to be under control, but your anger needs to end on an up note, if that's possible. You don't want to have a situation where you have displayed some anger and then everybody walks away and nothing is resolved. You need to end up on an up note where some type of resolution has occurred. You need to be articulate in your level of anger, and that would say that you need to control. Can you be angry in a controlled manner? Now that would suggest that you actually planned or were ready for a demonstration of anger. I gave you an example several weeks ago, and I don't know what the context of our discussion was, but I told you that as a coach in an indoor track meet one time, I was so upset with this young lady with what she probably wasn't doing. I took my clipboard and I threw it toward her, but I threw it over her head, well over her head, knowing I wasn't going to hit her, and it went into the wall. and it was a fit of controlled anger. Now, it didn't end up like I thought it would. I don't think it was a good teaching moment. I thought it was probably a poor choice of behavior on my part. I wish I hadn't done it. Nobody got hurt. Nobody got hit. But it was an example of articulating a level of anger. And if the anger is directed at you, ask for specifics of the issue. Here's an example out of a coaching experience I had. The morning before a track meet one time, we were to travel to this university, and I got a call at home from the coach. Very unusual. And he started out very pleasantly, and then all of a sudden he got into a fit of rage and said if I wanted to start a blankety-blank war, he would accommodate me. And what do you mean? And he accused me of bad-mouthing their program and in trying to recruit a young lady. And I was so taken aback and not knowing what to say, and younger, and he was much more experienced, he was older, and I didn't really know what to say. And as I look back on that, I should have asked for specifics. Now, wait a minute, if you want to talk about this, tell me who we're talking about. Give me the accuser. Tell me who says that I said that. What is it I'm supposed to have said? And down the line, and I obviously didn't think of that. And so nothing really ever was resolved, and I still don't know who he was talking about or what it is I was supposed to have said. So he obviously knew what he was going to say, and he had no intention of resolving it on the phone. And I had no way of knowing what to say at the time, and I could have probably lowered the temperature of you, if you will, of the discussion by being calm and asking for specifics. But it's a lesson I learned, and I think I've gotten a little better with that as time goes on. Use positive nonverbal cues. You know, it's said that more often it's the way you say it is more critical than what you say. So if you say something in anger or in a loud voice, it can give it totally the wrong message. Be aware of the nonverbal cues that you are using when you talk. And this doesn't have to be in a coaching situation. You'll be talking with your friends, talking with your family. Be aware of your body position, of what you're doing with your arms and your hands, and your facial expressions, and whether you are giving eye contact. There are good nonverbal cues and there are bad ones, and you need to choose them wisely. You need to teach skills. This is number 9 on the 10 Commandments here. Sport pedagogy. Now, those of you who are in teacher education, there's 2 or 3 of you in the class, are familiar, or should be, with this word pedagogy, because it's learning how to teach your subject. Well, sport pedagogy is the same. You need to be able to learn how to teach skills. And the surveyed coaches from this author overwhelmingly expressed that they wanted better teaching methods and techniques to teach skills. One of the schools I taught at, we hosted in our facility the city schools where we live, our college was located. They came in every year and had a very large elementary physical education convention. And they would put out a book each year called Games That Work. And these were contributions by physical educators everywhere in the state who had really cool physical education teaching games And because if you become a physical educator, sometimes you're just looking under rocks for things to do. And so the very title of this workshop, Games That Work, these physical educators would come and spend the day at our university and learn from seasoned veterans how to use games that were instructional yet kept the same vigor within the physical education concept. And finally, interacting consistently with all your team members. Don't give all your attention to just the starters or the best players. There's a young man that at one of the schools when I was coaching, I was head women's coach, and a young man that was average at best, and he really was ignored by the men's coach. And it just so happened that he fell within my area of expertise in terms of jumps, and he sort of gravitated toward me because I paid attention to him. And I ended up basically coaching him, and we became good friends. And the consistency or inconsistency of coaching relationships means so much. And let me just give a plug for the relationships that last. Do you have a coach that you can think of that your relationship has continued even after high school? Or do you have a coach now that you're sure that after high school or after college you will continue to keep that relationship with that coach? I had a high school coach that we kept this relationship for years, and actually until he died. It was a very special relationship. One of the things that goes along with interacting with your team members is something that we call the self-fulfilling prophecy, or sometimes you hear it called the Pygmalion effect. Athletes often perform like coaches expect them to. And this particular concept has been proven time and time again in the classroom. For example, in the lower grades, and maybe we're getting away from this in the American system, but traditionally in the lower grades, the boys are expected to do better in math and science. That's just the way it has always been. There's no good reason for that, but that's traditionally how it's gone. And they have done studies to show that where that occurs in the classroom in the lower grades, boys actually do better in math and science because they are the ones the teachers are calling on, and they're calling less on the girls, more on the boys. And the girls get the idea that, well, I'm not expected to be really, really good in math and science, so I guess I'm not. And maybe they don't try hard. But that's the self-fulfilling prophecy. And we tend to do that in athletics as well. We may not expect an athlete to do very well, and somehow we are intimating that to them. We're transferring that idea, that message to them. Let me go back to the movie Hoosiers. If you'll remember, I guess none of you had seen that movie, but there's a part in the movie where the coach is introduced to all the players, and there's only about 6 or 7 of them, and he finally gets to the last one, and he's the shortest one, and he just flat out tells the coach, well, I'm not very good. I'm kind of more of a manager, but I'm here and I wear a uniform. And so the message had been to him throughout his high school career, at least, that he wasn't that good. And so we don't expect much from you, so don't expect to play much. When actually he became very vital in the role of that championship team that year from that high school. Your author talks a little about team meetings. Concentrate on a couple of meaningful issues. You don't want to go into a team meeting with a full agenda, because you're only going to get through a couple of things. Be on time. If you're going to call a meeting, call it on time and be there. And make some positive first statements. I can remember, and this was rather early in my coaching career. I had a young lady in cross country. She had some talent, but she had some issues with. I'm not sure what they were exactly. I guess I should have figured them out. But one day, her boyfriend came into my office in a huff, and he sat down real hard in his chair, and he looked at me and said, "You've got to change your coaching techniques." And that kind of took me aback. And right away, you open with a statement like that, and it's going to go downhill. And so we talked, and maybe worked a few things out. But my point here is that when you have a meeting, either with the team or with an individual, there needs to be positive first statements. There should be no accusations made. As you talk as a coach, use I statements, not you statements. You guys do this, you guys do that. And let me remind you or encourage you, whether you're teaching, whether you're coaching, whatever you do, and you have responsibility for individuals, document what happens. Make documentation. You take notes. You write down dates so that if something ever comes back, you have it right there in your notes, and you're able to say, well, on such and such a day, a time, we talked about this, as opposed to, well, I think it was maybe 2 weeks ago and we talked about. No, document everything that goes on. Mentoring, being a good mentor, taking interest in a less experienced or younger coach. I have examples on both sides of that. When I first started teaching on the college level, one of my mentors was the athletic director where I was teaching, and I was getting some advice from him in terms of getting started to teach. And one of the things he said to me that has stuck with me the entire time, and it's not a big thing, but it was very helpful. He said, what I do is I look first to see, okay, how many days are we going to meet in this semester? And I write down all the dates. And then I determine, okay, where do I want to put those exams? And how am I going to divide out those chapters? And what's due when? And where do those vacations fall? And it just clicked with me. I thought that makes so much sense. And ever since then, I've done a modified version of that, and I'll forever